They told you the church holds the keys to heaven. But what if it's been hiding the doorway to something far older and far more dangerous? Beneath Vatican City lies a vault no one is allowed to open, not because it protects faith, but because it might destroy everything we were told to believe. You were never meant to hear what you're about to hear. Beneath the polished marble corridors of Vatican City lies something the world was never meant to see. Not a chapel, not a gallery, but a vault older than most nations, sealed, guarded, locked behind miles of stone and silence. The Vatican Secret Archives, they call it that. But what's in a name, when even the word secret barely scratches the surface? This isn't a place you can visit. There are no guided tours, no public tickets. Not even most priests will ever set foot inside. Because this is not a library, it's a fortress. One that holds more than books. It holds forbidden memory. They say the walls run over 50 miles deep with shelves. A labyrinth of locked knowledge. But more haunting is what's not on the shelves. What's hidden behind layers of permissions, papal decrees, and unspoken fear. You see, this vault is not just a collection of history. It is a graveyard of erased timelines, stories rewritten, gospels suppressed, mystics silenced, truths too powerful to let roam free. For centuries, popes, kings, and secret orders have buried things here. Scrolls, letters, trials, prophecies, blueprints, rituals. Things that, if revealed, would shatter the version of reality we were fed. But why? Why lock them away? Why not let the light in? Because some knowledge threatens power. Some truths dissolve control. And for an empire built on obedience, awakening is the ultimate rebellion. The vault was never just a vault. It was a veil, a curtain drawn across the centuries to obscure what came before the church, and perhaps what came beyond it. They say Jesus' original teachings may be in there. They say letters from Mary Magdalene, censored Gnostic Gospels, accounts of miracles never canonized, all rest in silence. And that's just the surface. What if the Vatican is hiding not just faith, but technology, not just heretics, but witnesses, not just prophecy, but proof? What if deep beneath the Sistine ceilings and golden altars, there lies a doorway, not metaphorical, but literal, into the forbidden past of humanity? A past that questions not just church doctrine, but the entire story of civilization. You were never supposed to know this. And yet, here you are, curious, awake, and perhaps, finally, ready to pull the veil. Because the real question is not what's in the vault. The real question is, why have they worked so hard to make sure you never open it? 53 miles, that's not an exaggeration. That's the documented length of shelving hidden within the Vatican Secret Archives. 53 miles of memory, of manuscripts and scrolls, of sealed documents and silenced names, of power, recorded and buried. They call it the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. But secret in Latin doesn't just mean hidden. It means set apart, not for the public, not for the faithful, not even for most scholars. Only the highest levels of clergy and select academics granted special permission by the Holy See are allowed inside. And even then, access is limited to specific documents, in a controlled reading room, under constant supervision. Why? What could possibly require this level of control? Over 35,000 volumes. And that's just what's acknowledged. Volumes written in forgotten tongues, volumes containing correspondences between popes and emperors, inquisitors and kings, mystics and excommunicated rebels. Some believe the original trial records of the Knights Templar are buried in those shelves, a case so cloaked in mystery that entire movements have formed just to decipher its echoes. Others whisper about the lost Gospels, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas. Texts once revered, then erased, declared heresy by the same institutions that now claim spiritual authority. Why would they be hidden instead of destroyed? Because even they knew some truths are too powerful to burn. They must be contained. Among the shelves lie letters from Galileo. After the Church condemned him for claiming the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, there are whispers of classified correspondence with Hitler, buried alliances the world was never meant to question. And then there are the stranger things, rumors of ancient maps showing lands that shouldn't exist, blueprints of devices etched in the margins of medieval manuscripts, machines described with eerie resemblance to modern technology, reports of strange phenomena observed by saints, visions, lights, visitations, all quietly catalogued and tucked away. And yet, the question echoes louder than the records themselves. Why? Why collect so much, only to hide it? Because history is not just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. And when a single institution has the power to erase, edit, and obscure, truth becomes currency, and currency becomes control. Imagine if humanity had access to those scrolls. What would change? What forgotten wisdom might resurface? What suppressed technologies might be rediscovered? And what illusions might finally shatter? This is not just about dusty pages and old parchment. It's about a carefully curated silence, a silence stretching 53 miles long. One that speaks louder than any sermon, because what's hidden in those archives is not just history. It's the evidence of a much older, much stranger world, one that still lives beneath our own, waiting, and perhaps finally stirring. There's something haunting about a locked door, not just because of what's behind it, but because someone decided you weren't allowed to look. The Vatican secret archives weren't always so secret. In fact, they were once called something else entirely, until the pressure grew too great, and the veil had to be adjusted, not lifted. For centuries, this vault sat hidden behind the formal name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. But in 2019, something changed. Pope Francis quietly renamed it. The secret archives were now to be called the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Why? According to Vatican officials, it was a matter of misunderstanding. They claimed that the word secret had been misinterpreted by modern culture, that it didn't mean hidden, it simply meant private. But if that were true, why did it take centuries to change? Why now? Why, after generations of silence, did the Church feel the need to reframe the archives as something less suspicious? Because curiosity was growing. Too many scholars had begun asking questions. Too many theories were surfacing. Too many truths were clawing at the vault door. They said the name change was an act of transparency. But there was no change in access. No floodgates opened. No buried records released. Just a new sign on the same locked gate. And that's the strange power of language. A name can cloak the truth. A rebrand can recast suspicion as innocence. But the archives remain the same. They were formed in the 17th century by Pope Paul V, at a time when Europe was unraveling and the Church was losing ground. Protestantism was rising. Rebellions were breaking out. Science was challenging scripture. And so, a decision was made to seal the knowledge, to collect the most dangerous documents under one roof and bury them beneath papal authority, not destroyed, contained. Because even back then, the Church knew there's power in what people don't know. For over 300 years, the vault remained closed to outsiders. Only in 1881 did Pope Leo XIII open limited access to select scholars. And even then, the rules were strict. Only certain documents could be requested, only certain years, only pre-approved topics. You couldn't wander, you couldn't browse, you couldn't uncover anything that hadn't already been allowed. And so, even with its new name, the vault stayed sealed, not just physically, but ideologically, because the greatest secrets weren't in what they admitted, but in what they refused to acknowledge at all. The name may have changed, but the energy didn't. The Vatican Apostolic Archives remain a fortress, a locked chamber of history, renamed, repainted, rebranded, but never truly revealed. And the question that echoes louder than ever is this: if the door is still shut, what exactly are they still trying to protect? Not everyone can walk through those ancient iron doors. In fact, almost no one can. For all its claims of openness, the Vatican Archives are not like a library. They are a sanctum, a fortress wrapped in ritual, and access is a privilege granted only to the chosen few. But who chooses and why? To enter the archives, you must be a qualified scholar, with credentials the Vatican deems acceptable. Not just any historian, not just any seeker of truth. Your topic must be precise, your time period limited, your request pre-approved. There are no spontaneous discoveries here, no wandering the aisles, no asking forbidden questions. You are escorted, watched. You are told where you can go and where you cannot. And this control raises an even deeper question. Who decides what is sacred and what must remain secret? The answer lies not in scripture, but in power. For centuries, the Curia, the administrative body of the Holy See, has managed access. But even they are not the final gatekeepers. Above them sits the archivist of the Vatican, a high-ranking official appointed by the Pope himself. This person doesn't just oversee documents, they oversee the flow of truth. And that flow is narrow by design. Because the archives are not a neutral place. They are curated, shaped by centuries of decisions, some theological, some political, some far more shadowed. What is available to researchers reflects a specific narrative. What is sealed reflects what threatens that narrative. And even among the few permitted inside, there are levels of clearance. Not everything is visible. Not everything is even catalogued. There are documents that exist only by rumor. Texts said to be stored in sealed boxes, guarded in climate-controlled vaults far below the surface, beyond even the scholar's reach. Some claim these include letters from excommunicated mystics. Others speak of lost books of the Bible. Even testimonies from witnesses to events that would shatter what we call history. But whether or not these claims are true, we may never know. Because the Church decides what is history, and they decide what is heresy. And when the line between the two is drawn behind locked gates, what kind of truth is it really? There are whispers of cardinals who've glimpsed texts they were never meant to see, and were silenced, of researchers who asked the wrong question, and found their access revoked without explanation. The Vatican doesn't need to burn books anymore. It simply buries them. And in doing so, it controls the narrative of faith, of power, of reality itself. Because if only a few are allowed to see the full picture, the rest of the world can only see what they are shown. And when knowledge is curated by a priesthood of gatekeepers, is it still truth, or has it become something else entirely? They say the victors write history, but in this case, the victors didn't just write it, they buried the rest. Beneath the polished theology of modern religion, beneath the chants and incense and cathedrals, there are missing pages, whole gospels lost, books burned, names erased, voices silenced not by time, but by design. In the depths of the Vatican secret archives, there are whispers, not only of what was preserved, but what was hidden. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, texts that paint a different Jesus, not a distant deity to be worshipped, but a master of inner awakening, teaching that the kingdom of God is within, that salvation is not obedience, but remembrance. Mary Magdalene, not a harlot, but perhaps the closest disciple, a teacher in her own right, erased from history not because she lacked wisdom, but because she had too much. Thomas, who wrote not of rules and rituals, but of gnosis, direct knowing, mystical insight, the inner light that reveals truth without need for temples or priests. These were not heretics. They were initiates, mystics, witnesses to something far more intimate than the church could control. And so the scrolls were hidden, the names smeared, the teachings distorted, and a new narrative began, one that could be managed, enforced, institutionalized. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, changed everything. Suddenly, the suppressed voices of early Christians began to rise again. Texts long thought destroyed surfaced, vibrating with truth that felt older than the walls of any basilica. But ask yourself this: if those were found in the desert, what still lies buried in the vault beneath Rome? What letters did the apostles write that never made it to canon? What rituals did the early Gnostics practice? That threatened the rising hierarchy, because to hide something, you must first fear its power. The early church didn't just want order, it wanted authority. And nothing challenges authority more than a teaching that says you don't need it, a gospel that tells you you are already divine, that the light does not live in a chalice or a robe, but in you. This is what the mystics knew. And this is what the archives may still contain. So the question remains, what would happen if these lost voices rose again? Would the church crumble? Would faith be freed? Or would something even deeper awaken? Not a religion, but a remembering. They feared that. And so they buried it. But truth has a pulse. And sometimes you can still hear it echo between the stone walls of silence. They called her a sinner, a harlot, a woman healed of demons. But what if that story was never hers? What if the woman the world was told to shame was the one the teacher loved most? Not in secret, but in spirit. Mary Magdalene, not a footnote, not a background figure, but a pillar, a disciple. And in some texts, the disciple, buried deep in the sands of time and in the vaults beneath the Vatican, is a gospel that carries her name, the Gospel of Mary, and in its pages, a revelation too powerful for the early church to allow. She speaks not of sin, not of salvation through suffering, but of inner truth, of visions, of the soul's ascent, of the illusion of death, and the light beyond form. She tells of a conversation with the Christ Not the Jesus of sermons, but the awakened one, who tells her that the soul must move through realms of darkness, through fear, desire, ignorance, and transcend them. It's not a doctrine, it's a map, a mystical journey inward, and she understood it more than the others. That's why Peter questioned her, why the male disciples doubted her. How could he have spoken to a woman and not to us? Because power has always trembled before a woman who remembers. Mary wasn't erased for being weak. She was erased because she carried the other half of the teaching. The sacred masculine may move mountains, but the sacred feminine reveals the soul. And in her gospel, the Christ doesn't ask to be worshipped. He asks to be known through stillness, through the heart, through the union of opposites. She speaks of the mind's illusion, the false self that clings, fears, divides. And she calls us not to follow, but to awaken. This was dangerous, because if the soul's journey is inward, what use is hierarchy? What need is there for gatekeepers when the temple is already within? Mary carried a lineage, not of priests, but of priestesses, of oracles, of those who knew the divine not through rules, but through revelation. And yet, for centuries, her voice was silenced, her teachings cast aside, her story rewritten by men who feared what she knew, that the divine feminine was never meant to be submissive. She was meant to be sovereign, wise, holy, and whole. And now, she returns, through fragments, through scrolls, through souls like yours, who feel the pull of a truth that was never truly lost, because you can bury a gospel, but not its frequency. And somewhere, perhaps deep in the archives they never wanted you to see, her full voice still waits, not for validation, but for remembrance. It didn't begin with a sacred revelation. It began with an emperor. In the year 325 AD, under the vaulted ceilings of Nicaea, bishops gathered not to seek divine wisdom, but to obey imperial command. This was not a council of saints. It was a convergence of strategy. Constantine, Rome's first Christian emperor, wanted unity, not of spirit, but of state. The empire was fractured, doctrines varied, and belief was a battlefield. So he summoned the church's most powerful voices, not to explore the mysteries of Christ, but to define him, to decide once and for all what could be called truth and what would be buried. And they did. In a vote. Yes, a vote. The nature of Jesus, the divinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, what books would stay, what gospels would vanish, what truths would be labeled heresy, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. Dozens of texts gone. The Gospel of Thomas, which taught that the kingdom of God is within you. The Gospel of Philip, which hinted at sacred union and divine embodiment. The Gospel of Mary, which offered a vision beyond hierarchy. These were not burned with rage. They were removed with precision. A narrative was chosen, one that served power, one that placed divinity above humanity, one that made salvation external, one that turned mystics into martyrs and gnosis into blasphemy. The Council of Nicaea didn't protect faith. It rebranded it. It took a living mystery and turned it into a system that could be managed, controlled, expanded. And from that moment, what was once a diverse chorus of spiritual voices became a single chant of obedience. The church would call it orthodoxy, but to many, it was the beginning of spiritual amnesia, because what they erased wasn't just books, it was a way of knowing, a truth that lived in the body, in the breath, in direct communion with the divine. The early followers of the Way, the mystics, the Gnostics, the seekers, they didn't need cathedrals. They didn't fear death. They knew the soul could speak with source. But that kind of freedom, it couldn't be governed. So the council sealed it behind doctrine, behind fear, behind a cross that no longer pointed inward, but up to someone else. And yet, here you are, listening, feeling, remembering. Because the soul doesn't forget. It may go silent for centuries, but the truth has a pulse, and it's beating again. The real question is, what happens when those gospels rise again? When the pieces they erased return in you? Because they can control the narrative, but not the awakening. In the silence of locked drawers and dimly lit rooms, ink dried on paper that history tried to forget. Not sermons, not scripture, but letters. Letters between the most powerful men in robes and the most dangerous men in history. The Vatican Archives hold many secrets, but some are more chilling than ancient scrolls. They are typed, signed, sealed, and sent between popes and dictators. Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, names etched in church history. But what about the names on the other end? Hitler, Mussolini, Franco. Yes, there was correspondence. In 1933, a concordat, a diplomatic agreement, was signed between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. It was called the Reichskonkordat, and it guaranteed the Church certain freedoms, as long as it didn't interfere in politics. But silence too is a form of consent. While Hitler rose to power, while synagogues burned, while children were ripped from their homes, the Vatican's voice, the moral voice of the Christian world, stayed quiet, publicly neutral, privately complex. Documents show the Vatican had early warnings. Reports came in from priests, from bishops, from diplomats, about camps, about persecution, about the plan unfolding beneath the swastika. And yet, the archives reveal little resistance. Instead, concern. Concern about communism, concern about the church's status, concern about preserving influence in a world gone mad. There were efforts, yes, quiet attempts to shelter some Jewish families, isolated priests who defied orders to protect the innocent, heroes in the shadows. But the silence from the top, it echoed louder. Then there's Mussolini, the architect of fascism. He signed the Lateran Treaty with the Church in 1929, making Vatican City a sovereign state. It was a moment of triumph for the papacy and a trade. The Church gained power. Mussolini gained legitimacy. And while dissidents were jailed, while propaganda filled the air, the Church stood, unmoved. Some historians say it was pragmatism. Others call it complicity. The letters themselves, many still sealed, tell a deeper story of moral compromise, of diplomacy dressed as detachment, of spiritual authority entangled with political ambition. What was the price of that silence? How many lives slipped into the void? While prayers were whispered behind gilded altars, the Church has since offered words of regret, but the archives remain, their doors mostly closed, their truths carefully curated. Because behind every letter is a choice, and behind every choice, a shadow. The Vatican is not just a seat of holiness, it is a seat of power, and power, unchecked, often chooses self-preservation over truth. But now, the walls are speaking. The archives are not dead. They're waiting for the world to ask the question. It was never meant to ask, what does it mean when those entrusted with light make deals with darkness? High atop Mount Graham in Arizona, far from cathedrals and confessionals, sits a telescope. But this isn't just any observatory. This one belongs not to NASA, but to the Vatican. And its name, Lucifer. Yes, you heard that right. The Vatican Dash, keepers of holy relics, guardians of faith, are watching the stars through an instrument named after the morning star. And the question echoes, why? The official story sounds simple: astronomy, science, an effort to study creation as part of divine curiosity. But dig deeper, and things become strange. Mount Graham itself is sacred to indigenous Apache tribes. They've long claimed the mountain holds portals, a thinning of the veil between worlds, a place where spirits move and stars speak. And now, atop this sacred peak, the Vatican watches the heavens. They say the Lucifer instrument, an acronym, they insist, stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. A mouthful of technical jargon. But here's what they don't say. They don't say why church officials needed to install an advanced infrared telescope. They don't say why they partnered with Jesuit astronomers who've spent decades scanning deep space for exoplanets and something else. Because beyond public science, there are whispers. Whispers that they're watching for signs, not of aliens, but of prophecy. Former Vatican insiders, like Brother Guy Consul Magno, director of the Vatican Observatory, have hinted at life beyond Earth. He once said, "If we ever make contact, we will baptize them." A joke, a clue. Ancient texts from the Book of Enoch to the Dead Sea Scrolls speak of watchers from the sky, beings of light who descended, who taught, who warned. Is the Vatican trying to reconcile science with Scripture? Or are they preparing for something they already know is coming? The Lucifer telescope peers not just into space, but into the unseen. It scans in the infrared, the spectrum that sees heat, but also cloaked light, hidden forms, things invisible to the naked eye. And here's the unsettling part. In mystic traditions, Lucifer doesn't mean devil. It means light bringer. So what light is the Vatican really chasing? What darkness are they hoping to illuminate? Some believe they're watching for a return, a celestial event long prophesied, a body in the sky, a sign in the heavens, a trigger that could shake the foundations of all religious systems. Others believe it's deeper, not about what's out there, but what's waking up in here, in the collective consciousness. The Lucifer telescope may not be a weapon, but it might be a mirror, pointed outward, yet revealing what's been buried inward. Because when an empire of faith begins peering into the stars, you have to ask, what truth is so great it made them look up? And what fear is so ancient they dare not look away? There are things we're told to laugh at. Little green men, flying saucers, lights in the sky that vanish before anyone can prove they were real. But what if the ones laughing aren't the ones who know, behind the granite walls of the Vatican, buried in the deepest layers of the archives, are documents most people will never see. Some sealed, some classified, some quietly ignored. But they all point to one truth. The Church may already know. We're not alone. For centuries, strange lights and celestial phenomena were recorded by monks, popes, and mystics. In 1561, a mass sighting in Nuremberg described aerial objects in battle. Red spheres, black arrows, silver discs. The people looked to the sky, and the Church looked away. But not really. Reports were gathered, letters exchanged, and some were quietly filed in the very place where inconvenient truths are kept silent, the secret archives. Fast forward to modern times. In 2008, Father José Gabriel Funes, director of the Vatican Observatory, publicly stated, "The existence of extraterrestrials does not contradict our faith." Let that sink in. A high-ranking Vatican scientist, not denying aliens, but welcoming them. He continued, "Just as there is a multiplicity of creatures on Earth, there can be other beings, even intelligent ones, created by God." This wasn't a slip, it was permission, and it wasn't the first time. In 1999, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, a Vatican theologian, spoke openly of extraterrestrials. He claimed the Church was quietly monitoring contact events, and that many so-called abductions were not hallucinations, but real experiences misunderstood by modern psychology. He said the beings were not demons, they were something else. But here's where it gets even more strange. Whistleblowers from intelligence agencies, including the CIA and Italian military, have confirmed that UFO sightings over Rome were investigated in coordination with Vatican officials. Why would a spiritual institution need to track craft in the sky? Unless they already knew. Unless contact had happened before. Ancient paintings depict glowing orbs above religious scenes. Medieval manuscripts tell of beings descending from chariots of fire. And in the apocryphal texts the Church rejected, like the Book of Enoch, the Watchers were said to descend from the stars, bringing knowledge, destruction, and prophecy. Could these have been the first contacts? And if so, what did they reveal? Some believe the Vatican holds manuscripts, untranslated, unreleased, describing encounters between early Church figures and non-human intelligences. Others claim papal decrees were issued to suppress any doctrine that suggested humanity was not the center of creation. Because what happens to power when the story changes? What happens to control when the heavens open? The truth is not just out there. It may already be filed, stamped, and buried beneath Vatican City. And the ones who've seen it, they no longer wonder if we're alone. They wonder why the rest of us still think we are. They say the Vatican Archives stretch for 53 miles. But what if that's just the surface? What if, beneath the documented halls and shadowed corridors, beneath even the layers of sealed scrolls and locked vaults, there's something deeper? A place that's not listed on any map, a floor that isn't drawn in the architectural plans, a chamber forbidden even to the cardinals sworn to protect it. Some call it the library beneath the library. Others whisper a more haunting name, the Shadow Vault. It's said to be protected not just by locked doors and stone, but by men trained to kill, the Swiss Guard, dressed in ceremony on the surface. But make no mistake, they are soldiers, elite, silent, absolute. They're not just there to guard the Pope. They're stationed at thresholds no tourist will ever see. Former insiders, monks, scholars, even defected clergy, have spoken in code about a lower level, accessed only through a hidden elevator in the Apostolic Palace. No cameras, no records. Only clearance granted through bloodlines, legacy, or power so high it doesn't have a name. But what's down there? Some say it's where the most ancient scrolls are kept, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in languages long forgotten: Sanskrit, Aramaic, Atlantean. Scripts that predate the Church itself. scripts that speak of civilizations erased from time. Others say it's home to devices, artifacts left behind from a different age, blueprints etched into metal, spheres that hum with vibration, books that glow faintly in the dark, unreadable by the modern eye, but alive. There are rumors that certain popes were taken there before their coronation to see what lies behind the veil, to understand what they're really inheriting. Some left shaken, others never spoke of it again. And there's a silence around it, not just in words, but in energy, a kind of psychic barrier, as if the place itself resists being named. But every now and then, a clue escapes. In 1996, a visiting scholar from the Pontifical Institute vanished without explanation. His research focused on non-canonical gospels and early cosmic myths. He was last seen requesting a document no one would confirm exists. Some say he asked to go deeper. Others say he found what he was looking for and was never allowed to leave. Because this isn't just a library, it's a sanctum, a vault of forbidden origins, not just of religion, but of reality. And if what's rumored to be held there is true, then everything we know about human history, divine contact, and the architecture of our world was edited. Down there behind the uniforms and smiles, beneath the gold and incense, something ancient watches. Not God, not angels, but memory, the kind that was never meant to surface. And the question isn't just what's down there. The question is, why are they willing to guard it with their lives? There was a time when to be Christian was to believe in many lives. Not just one chance, not just one judgment, but a spiral, a return, a sacred unfolding of the soul, life after life, breath after breath, each one a lesson, each one a refinement. Early Christian mystics taught it. The Gnostics whispered of it in scrolls now labeled heretical. Even church fathers like Origen, a revered theologian in the 3rd century, spoke openly of reincarnation. He said the soul pre-existed the body, that we return to correct what was left incomplete, that salvation is not a one-time act, but an eternal journey back to source. So what happened? Why is it now labeled blasphemy? Why, in a church that claims to honor ancient teachings, was this one erased? The answer, as always, begins in power. In 553 CE, at the Second Council of Constantinople, a single doctrine, an imperial decree, changed everything. It was ruled that the soul lives only once, that eternal reward or damnation was handed out after a single lifetime. No second chances, no return. And with that, reincarnation became heresy. But why? Because a soul that knows it has time, that it can return, that its evolution is personal, not granted by authority, is a soul that cannot be controlled. The idea of reincarnation threatened the entire structure of fear-based religion. No more fire and brimstone to force obedience. No more eternal torment to keep people in line. Instead, there was personal responsibility, self-awareness, a cosmic justice system that operated far beyond the hands of priests. That kind of sovereignty couldn't be tolerated. And so, it was buried, not disproven, not discredited, just erased. Scrolls burned, teachings banned, teachers killed or renamed heretics. And in their place, a simplified story. One life, one test, one heaven or hell. But the soul never forgot. Across continents, the teaching remained. In Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, the Druidic traditions, ancient Egyptian rites. Even in the mystic branches of Christianity, it endured underground. The Cathars of southern France, before being hunted by the Inquisition, taught the soul's return. They believed this life was a purification, a journey to remember the divine within, again and again, until union. Modern near-death experiences echo it too. Countless testimonies of souls shown past lives, old karmas, familiar faces in new forms. It's not a fantasy, it's a forgotten framework, a sacred architecture buried not because it was false, but because it gave the power back to you. Imagine if you knew that this wasn't your first lifetime, that your fears, your gifts, your wounds didn't begin here, that your soul has always been trying to remember. Now imagine the institution that told you otherwise, that made you believe your fate hung on a single confession to a man in robes. That is the theft, not just of knowledge, but of memory. And now, you are beginning to remember. They didn't burn everything. Some books were too sacred, too strange, too powerful. So they weren't destroyed. They were hidden, locked behind Vatican walls, placed beneath marble and oath, where only silence would read them. These weren't ordinary texts. They were whispers from another time, from mystics, alchemists, and Gnostic scribes who dared to write what others only glimpsed in dreams. Books that spoke not of worship, but of awakening. The Hermetica, a collection of ancient teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, was once considered sacred. It revealed a universe built on correspondence as above, so below. A divine science, one that taught that man is not separate from God, but a reflection of the divine in motion. The early church feared this, because if the divine is within, who needs a priest to access heaven? So these texts, once studied by early Christians and Renaissance thinkers alike, were slowly buried under doctrine. Then came the Gnostics. They didn't just follow Christ, they experienced him. To them, Christ wasn't a figure to worship, but a state to embody, a living gnosis, knowledge not learned but remembered. They wrote of Sophia, the divine feminine, of inner light, soul memory, and the illusion of the world. But the church couldn't control mystics, so their writings were declared heresy. Whole communities, like the Essenes and Cathars, were massacred, and their scrolls taken, not to be burned, to be hidden. Even the alchemists, those strange seekers blending science and spirit, were not spared, because they weren't just trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to transmute the soul, to awaken divine essence through sacred fire. Alchemy was a metaphor and a map, and it terrified the keepers of order. The Vatican knew the power of these teachings, which is why the writings of Paracelsus, Agrippa, and others now sit, sealed, in its forbidden vaults. Some say the hidden library contains entire shelves of texts never translated, written in languages lost to time, filled with sigils, codes, rituals, and visions that could collapse the divide between spirit and matter. Because that's the truth they never wanted known, that the bridge to the divine is not outside you, it is inside, unlocked not by obedience, but by remembrance. The mystics were not madmen, they were map makers, navigating the soul through inner stars, subtle bodies, and the flames of purification. And for centuries, those maps were hidden. But now, they are resurfacing, in the dreams of seekers, in the whispers of the forgotten, in the ancient texts finally being translated after centuries of silence, because truth never dies, it only waits. And you were born in the time of remembering. The vault may still be sealed, but the fire is already lit. Not all prophecy is welcome. Some visions are so raw, so disruptive to power, that silence becomes the preferred response. And in the depths of the Vatican Archives, beyond the official records and doctrinal edicts, lie scrolls, pages, and testimonies. Not of doctrine, but of destiny. Visions that were buried, warnings that were rewritten, prophets that were praised publicly and censored privately. Take the 3 secrets of Fatima. In 1917, 3 shepherd children in Portugal claimed to receive visions of the Virgin Mary. The Church confirmed the miracle, canonized the children, built shrines. But the 3rd secret, that one was different. It was said to be so dangerous, so politically and spiritually volatile, that it was locked in a sealed envelope and handed directly to the Vatican. For decades, popes read it and refused to reveal it. John the 23rd read it and said, "This does not concern my time." John Paul. I read it and died mysteriously 1 month later. And when John Paul II finally disclosed it in 2000, the version released felt incomplete, sanitized, as if something had been edited out or rewritten entirely. Some say the true prophecy spoke of corruption within the Church, of a future war between faith and illusion, of an age when the veil would be lifted and the world would have to choose between comfort and awakening. And that's not the only vision they buried. The mystic Hildegard of Bingen described celestial upheaval and a coming age of purification. Her texts were buried for centuries. St. Malachi offered a list of future popes, ending with a final figure described as Peter the Roman, who would preside over the Church's collapse. A prophecy quietly dismissed, though eerily accurate in its timeline. Even Nostradamus, studied and debated for centuries, was once investigated by Church officials, not to verify his predictions, but to control their influence. Why? Because prophecy disrupts structure. Because a vision, once planted in the collective mind, becomes a seed. And if that seed contradicts the authority of the institution, it must be hidden, not debated. In the forbidden corners of the Vatican's vaults are manuscripts that speak of great changes, of spiritual revolutions, of an age when the hidden will be revealed and the old systems will tremble under the weight of truth. But here's the paradox. If they truly believed these prophecies were false, why lock them away? If they were myths, why hide them? Because prophecy, even if partially misunderstood, carries a vibration, one that awakens, one that pierces through programming, one that reminds humanity that divine truth isn't written by councils. It erupts through the soul. Maybe the real fear wasn't that the prophecies were wrong. Maybe the fear is that they were right. And if that's true, then everything we were told about the future and the authority to define it begins to unravel. The silence becomes suspicious, and the question becomes, what else have they hidden about the end of the age and the birth of the next? There's a strange echo inside Vatican City, one most people never hear. It doesn't sound like Latin prayers or church bells. It sounds older, darker, whispered through symbols carved in stone and names that don't belong in Christian scripture. Isis, Osiris, Horus, ancient Egypt, not just a civilization of the past, but a hidden blueprint buried beneath the very heart of the Church. You might think there's no connection between the papal throne and the pyramids, but step into St. Peter's Square and look again. At the center of the plaza stands an obelisk, a 4,000-year-old Egyptian monument that once stood in Heliopolis, city of the sun god Ra. It wasn't built by Rome. It was taken and placed deliberately at the axis of Vatican power. Why? Why would the holiest site of Christianity center an Egyptian solar pillar? The Vatican calls it symbolic, but symbols speak louder than words, because that obelisk isn't alone. Surrounding it is a massive circular plaza, a perfect mandala of 284 Doric columns and 88 pilasters, forming what some scholars argue mirrors the ancient solar calendar. Above the altar in St. Peter's Basilica rises the great bronze baldachin, whose swirling design is uncannily similar to the temple columns of Luxor. Coincidence? Or an inheritance? And then there are the texts. Buried in the deepest vaults of the Vatican Library are papyrus scrolls written in Coptic, Aramaic, and Greek, fragments of the Hermetica, the Gnostic Gospels, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They speak of soul journeys, resurrection rituals, divine feminine wisdom, and initiations through the underworld, all predating the Church by millennia. The early Church Fathers condemned these teachings as heresy, and yet they preserved them, not burned, not destroyed, preserved, hidden. Why keep what they claim to hate? Because maybe they knew. Maybe they recognized that what was rising in Egypt wasn't just myth, but sacred science, a system of awakening, encoded in temples and stars. The mysteries of Isis and Osiris were about the soul's death and rebirth, about the dismemberment of the ego and the resurrection of divine consciousness. Does that sound familiar? A dying God, a holy mother, a resurrection on the third day. These weren't stories stolen. They were stories remembered, retold under new names, new dogmas, new robes. But the symbols never lie, and the Vatican is full of them. Sun wheels, vesica piscis, hidden pine cones, a symbol of the pineal gland, long revered in Egyptian mysticism. Even the very name Vatican traces to vaticinatio, prophecy, a word rooted in the oracles of the ancient world. So what does this all mean? Maybe the Church didn't replace Egypt. Maybe it absorbed it, and behind the marble and incense, behind the cardinals and creeds, the old gods still speak, not in defiance, but in waiting. Waiting for us to remember the bridge between heaven and earth was always older than Rome. And the real temple was never fully Christian to begin with. There was a time when divinity had a mother's face, before the thunder of patriarchal creeds, before the holy books were bound in gold and guarded by men. The sacred feminine stood in the center of the temple, not as servant, but as source. Her name was whispered in many tongues. In Egypt, she was Isis, throne of heaven, healer of the broken. In Greece, Sophia, wisdom incarnate, mother of understanding. In early Christianity, she was Mary Magdalene. But something happened. The divine feminine, once honored as the bridge between spirit and form, was cast out. Not because she lost her power, but because she still had it. And power, in the hands of the few, cannot afford a goddess who awakens the many. So they rewrote her. They painted her not as priestess, but as prostitute. Not as teacher, but as temptation. They split the mother from the son. They stripped the goddess from the gospel, and in doing so, they severed humanity from half of its soul. You see, the suppression of the divine feminine was never just about theology. it was a calculated move in the architecture of control. Because when you remove the feminine, you remove the balance. You remove the nurturing, the intuitive, the mystical, the parts of spirit that threaten hierarchy. The early Gnostics didn't worship a distant male god. They spoke of Sophia, divine wisdom, who fell into matter to birth the cosmos. They revered the feminine as the vessel of gnosis, of direct knowing, not through priests, but through inner light. And that terrified the church, not because it was false, but because it was free, because the sacred feminine doesn't obey. She doesn't kneel. She bursts truth from within. And so, the councils convened. The texts were banned. The priestesses silenced. And over time, the sacred feminine became a ghost. But she never left. She remained in symbols, in whispers, in the hands of midwives and mystics and healers who kept her flame alive. She sang through the herbs, danced in the moonlight, and wept in the silence between cathedral walls. And now, she rises again. You feel her, don't you? In the ache for meaning, in the hunger for presence, in the rebellion against systems that no longer hold soul. Because the divine feminine isn't a figure. She's a frequency, a call back to the heart, to balance, to remembering that creation flows through both the sun and the soil. And the Vatican knew it. They hid her not because she was weak, but because she was the key. And now, as the veil thins, she's returning, not to destroy the old, but to restore what was buried beneath it, the sacred made whole again. They called it salvation, but what if it was erasure? What if the cross that was carried into distant lands wasn't just a symbol of faith, but a weapon of control? When colonizers stepped foot on sacred soil, in the Americas, in Africa, in Oceania, they didn't come alone. They came with banners, with scripture, with the silent mandate of empire dressed in the language of God. But the truth is, the people they met already had God. Not in cathedrals, but in rivers, in trees, in stories passed through breath and bone. They knew the land as mother, the stars as ancestors, the spirit world as something not to be feared, but honored. So the colonizers had a problem, not just with resistance, but with remembering, because indigenous wisdom doesn't submit. It roots, it remembers. It speaks to a truth deeper than doctrine. And the church, aligned with empire, knew that to build their new world, they had to dismantle the old one. They called the sacred practices of native peoples pagan. They called their medicines sorcery, their elders heretics. And slowly, systematically, they erased not just languages, but lineages, not just rituals, but relationships between people and the divine, between soul and soil. Entire cosmologies burned, not for their danger, but for their dignity. Because indigenous wisdom held a mirror to the church's lie. It showed that communion could be found in ceremony, not confession. That spirit could be heard in silence, not sermons. That God didn't belong to any one book, because God was everywhere, and still is. But the archives, buried beneath Vatican stone, know this story well, because hidden in those 53 miles of forbidden shelves are records, missionary logs, letters between popes and colonial governors, transcripts of interrogations, of forced baptisms, of spiritual conversions done at sword point. But more than that, the archives may hold the very wisdom they tried to destroy. Stolen codices, suppressed prophecies, encoded rituals seized from temples and sweat lodges, from altars carved into mountains, from songs passed down through the grandmothers. Because the church didn't just burn what it feared, it kept what it wanted. And if those documents were ever released, they wouldn't just rewrite history, they'd restore it. They'd vindicate the voices that were silenced. They'd reawaken the teachings that survived in shadow. And that's the real threat, not to theology, but to authority. Because if the world remembers that wisdom lives beyond Rome, if it remembers that spirit was never lost, only stolen, then the empire cracks, and in its place something older and truer rises again. Not new, not radical, but ancient, and finally, free. They preach the miracles, the sermons, the crucifixion. But what if the most powerful teachings of Jesus were never meant to be preached, only lived? Not the ones filtered through pulpits, not the ones carved into stained glass, but the ones whispered in secret, transmitted heart to heart, from teacher to initiate. Because long before the church made him a symbol, he was something far more dangerous. He was a revealer of what lies within. You see, the Jesus found in the Gnostic Gospels, the ones the church declared heresy, didn't speak of sin and salvation. He spoke of awakening. He didn't say, worship me. He said, become like me. He didn't demand obedience. He invited remembrance of the divine spark within, the Christ light not as a person, but as a presence. He taught that the kingdom of God was not in temples or in heaven, it was within you. And that was the threat, because once you know you carry the divine, you stop seeking it in institutions, you stop needing a mediator, you stop obeying out of fear, and power built on fear cannot survive that kind of freedom. So they hid it. They buried the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus says, split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me. They burned the Gospel of Mary, where she speaks of direct communion with the divine, free from hierarchy. They silenced the mystics who spoke of light within instead of law without, because the true teachings of Jesus weren't about salvation through suffering. They were about liberation through knowing yourself, knowing your source, and remembering that the two were never separate. In the hidden texts, Jesus is not a martyr to be mourned. He is a mirror of your own potential. He speaks not of punishment, but presence, not of original sin, but of original light. And when he says, I am the way, he doesn't mean worship my footsteps. He means walk yours with the same flame. But that message couldn't be mass marketed. It couldn't be codified into dogma. It couldn't be used to build cathedrals or control empires. So it was erased, rewritten, distorted, and what remained was a version of Jesus that served power, not truth, but the whispers never died. They lived in desert scrolls, in mystic poetry, in the quiet knowing of those who still heard his voice, beyond the page. Because the real Christ was never exclusive, never external. He was and is the light within, waiting to be seen, not in heaven, but in you. And maybe that's the greatest heresy of all, to remember that the church was never a building. It was your soul. There are whispers, not in sermons, not from the pulpit, but deep beneath the surface of Vatican vaults lies something that could undo it all. Not a scandal, not a sin, but a secret. A secret so destabilizing, so incendiary to the foundation of institutional faith, that even the whisper of its existence has been guarded with more devotion than Scripture itself. Documents that call into question the two pillars the Church was built upon: the resurrection and the virgin birth. The resurrection, the event that crowned Jesus divine, the cornerstone that separates Christianity from every other tradition, and the virgin birth, the immaculate myth that made Mary more symbol than woman. But what if both were symbolic, not lies, but metaphors, misunderstood, mistranslated, weaponized? In the suppressed Gnostic text, Jesus speaks not of a literal rising from the dead, but of rising in consciousness, of overcoming the illusion of death by realizing the eternal self. He says resurrection is not a future miracle, it is a present awakening. In the Gospel of Philip, once cherished by early mystics, the virgin birth is described not as biology, but as mystery, a metaphor for divine conception, not of body, but of soul. They called it the birth of light within the womb of matter. This wasn't mythology, it was mysticism. But mysticism doesn't build empires. Mysticism can't be controlled. And so, sometime between the Council of Nicaea and the rise of imperial Christianity, the metaphors became mandates, the symbols became statutes, and the living teachings of spiritual awakening were recast into a literal narrative, one that required belief, not experience, obedience, not inquiry, the text that spoke otherwise. They were buried, condemned, locked behind Vatican walls in language no one would translate. But fragments still exist. Ancient letters between bishops debating the nature of Christ's resurrection. Was it physical or symbolic? Parchments from early sects who followed the way, not as a religion, but as a path of inner transformation. Writings from mystics who insisted that what happened in the tomb was not the reanimation of a corpse, but the remembrance of the soul's eternal light. To question the resurrection is to question divinity. To question the virgin birth is to question the doctrine of purity. And to question both is to shake the church at its roots. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the sacred was never meant to be a fortress. Maybe faith was never meant to be fragile. Because if the truth can be shattered by a single scroll, was it ever truth? What if the resurrection isn't something that happened to one man, but something meant to happen in all of us? And what if hiding that dash, hiding the path to direct awakening, was the most calculated silence of all, not to protect the faithful, but to preserve the throne? He was supposed to be a transitional pope, quiet, unassuming, a brief breath between the old guard and whatever came next. But Pope John Paul I only breathed for 33 days, just over a month after ascending to the most powerful spiritual throne in the world. He was found dead in his bed. No autopsy, no investigation, no clear explanation. And to this day, the Vatican's official story remains a fog of contradictions. Was it a heart attack, a stroke, a quiet natural death, or was it something else? Because behind the smile of Albino Luciani, as he was known before the papacy, lived a man not afraid to look beneath the surface, a man who questioned the opulence of the church, who challenged its entanglement with power, and who, many believe, uncovered something he was never meant to see. In the days leading up to his death, insiders say he was preparing a list of bishops and cardinals tied to the Vatican bank scandal, names connected to secret Masonic lodges, names whispered in connection to money laundering, and worse. Pope John Paul I was reportedly ready to clean house, to expose what had been festering beneath the holy robes, to pull the veil, not just over finances, but over centuries of corruption. And that's when he died. According to the Vatican, he was found sitting up in bed, holding a book. But the nun who discovered him said otherwise. she was quickly silenced, replaced in the official story by a priest who wasn't even there. There was no autopsy, no medical transparency. His body was embalmed within hours. Some say it was protection from scandal, from panic, but others say it was a cover-up. John Paul, I was different. He spoke of returning the church to humility. He believed in transparency over tradition, and he asked questions, dangerous ones, about the Vatican Bank, about the ties to intelligence agencies, about secret archives he'd begun to request access to. And for 33 days, he tried. He moved quietly but deliberately, reassigning certain officials, pausing questionable transactions, planning sweeping reforms, then silence. The official line was simple: natural causes, but no papal death in modern history has ever felt so unnatural. 33 days, the same number as the age Jesus was said to be at crucifixion. A coincidence or a message? In his brief time, John Paul II became known as the Smiling Pope. But behind that gentle expression was a man on the edge of a reckoning. And maybe that's what made him dangerous, because in a system that depends on secrecy, even a little light can be lethal. What did he discover in those 33 days? What pages did he see in the vault? We may never know. But one thing is clear. He wasn't just a pope, he was a mirror. And mirrors in the wrong hands tend to shatter. There are secrets. And then there are secrets so profound, so destabilizing, that even whispering their name feels like trespass. One of them is called Project Secretum Omega. Almost nothing about it exists in official Vatican records. No press releases, no public documents, only rumors, leaked testimonies, and a trail of fear stretching across decades. According to the claims, Secretum Omega is the Vatican's highest classification of secrecy, above top secret, above any national intelligence clearance, a level so restricted only the Pope, a select few cardinals, and intelligence operatives tied to the Holy See have access. But what could require that level of silence? The answer might shatter everything we think we know. The story first emerged from an alleged Vatican insider, a Jesuit priest turned whistleblower. He claimed that in the early 1950s, the Vatican became aware of contact, not just with extraterrestrial intelligence, but with interdimensional beings, entities not from another planet, but from another plane of consciousness. The revelations, he said, were so staggering, so metaphysically disruptive, that a secret council was formed immediately, comprised of theologians, scientists, and intelligence agents, all bound by oaths sealed in blood. This group, under the umbrella of Secretum Omega, began collecting data, photographs, artifacts, transmissions, and most chillingly, accounts from souls who had crossed over. Because the Vatican wasn't just tracking aliens, they were studying the structure of reality, the soul, the afterlife, the interface between consciousness and form. One report allegedly detailed an encounter with a being that spoke not in words, but in pure frequency. It conveyed truths about creation, about reincarnation, about the soul's journey, that aligned not with Catholic doctrine, but with mystical teachings long banned by the Church. According to the leak, this being confirmed something radical: that Earth is not the center, that humanity is not alone, that the soul is eternal, and incarnation is a choice. The Vatican, faced with this revelation, did not deny it. They sealed it. Because if humanity knew what the Vatican allegedly knows, church authority would dissolve, dogma would crumble, And the idea of sin, control, obedience, all of it, would evaporate in the light of truth. Some say these files are kept in the lowest level of the secret archives. Others claim they're not even stored on paper, but encrypted in consciousness, guarded by spiritual technologies lost to modern minds. But this much is clear. Project Secretum Omega isn't just a code name. It's a veil, a boundary between the old world and the truth that waits beneath it. If real, it would mean the Church has known for decades that spiritual awakening is not a threat. It's inevitable. And still, they hide it. Not to protect the people, but to protect the power. Because once you realize your soul cannot be owned, shamed, or saved by any institution, you become something dangerous. You become free. Why does a religious institution care so much about the stars? Why does the Vatican own some of the most powerful observatories in the world, including one with a name that makes even skeptics pause? The LUCIFER telescope. Why does the Church, known for its devotion to scripture and tradition, quietly fund advanced studies in black holes, dark matter, and the origins of the universe? The answer is older than the Church itself. In a remote mountain range in Arizona, far from the gold and marble of Rome, the Vatican operates the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope in collaboration with the University of Arizona. It peers into deep space, not just to study stars, but to listen. Listen for what? That's the part they don't publish in journals. Beneath the surface level explanations of astrophysics and cosmic mapping lies something more esoteric. According to those close to the program, the Vatican is studying patterns, not just in stars, but in myth. They're comparing modern discoveries with ancient cosmologies from Sumeria, from Egypt, from the Hopi, the Dogon, and the Maya. Because the ancients weren't just gazing for beauty, they were tracking cycles. The Maya believed that time was not linear, but spiral. The Dogon of Mali described invisible stars and orbital patterns around Sirius, long before telescopes were invented. The Vedas speak of vast cosmic ages, yugas, where the soul itself evolves alongside the universe. And in every one of these traditions, the stars were not distant, they were alive. So what is the Church looking for? They say it's about understanding creation, but maybe it's about recognizing what's returning. In the book of Genesis, we're told the heavens declare the glory of God. But many early mystics believed that heavens wasn't just poetic, it was literal. The cosmos held messages, clues, codes, and the Vatican, quietly, has been decoding them. There are whispers that within the secret archives are scrolls and fragments describing celestial alignments tied to awakening events. Mass shifts in consciousness, catalyzed not by prophecy, but by resonance. The alignment of certain stars with Earth's position, awakening memory in the collective field. This is not astrology, it's cosmic anthropology, the study of human evolution through celestial timing. Why else would popes meet in private with physicists? Why else would the Vatican fund quantum cosmology conferences while preaching traditional creation to the masses? Because the real story is being studied in silence. The silence of telescopes trained on regions of space so dark, so ancient, they echo the first breath of existence. Maybe they're not searching for aliens. Maybe they're tracing the soul's origin. And maybe, just maybe, they've discovered that we didn't fall from grace. We fell from the stars. And everything since has been about finding our way back, quietly, carefully, before too many of us remember who we really are. They say the Vatican Library is one of the most secure places on earth. Surveillance in every corridor. Guards trained not just in tradition, but in discretion. Behind the doors of the Archivum Secretum, the quiet hum of protection is constant. But who exactly are they protecting? Is it the secrets themselves? Or is it us? Because once you ask what's inside, you must also ask, why does it need so much defense? This isn't just about ancient books, not just parchment and ink. This is about power, paradigms, perception. And the Church knows knowledge, when unleashed, is not just information, it is transformation. Some say the guards are there to prevent theft, but what's more dangerous than stealing gold is stealing truth, especially truth that contradicts everything people have been taught to believe. Truth that threatens not just a religion, but a world order. Among those shelves lie texts that never made it into the Bible, teachings that paint a different picture of Jesus, documents suggesting that resurrection wasn't about a body rising, but a consciousness awakening, scrolls that don't damn the soul to eternal punishment, but describe realms of light, rebirth, and cosmic evolution. Now imagine that knowledge getting out. The Vatican fears chaos, schisms, the breakdown of centuries of theological control, because once people realize God doesn't live in a building and never needed a mediator, then the structures crumble, the hierarchy loses its throne. But there's another possibility. Some say the Vatican guards what should not be known, that there are things, ancient forces, forbidden rituals, artifacts that were sealed away for good reason, pieces of technology not from this world, maps of forgotten gateways, warnings from beings we once called angels and now might call extraterrestrial. If even a fraction of those whispers are true, then the archives aren't a vault. They're a prison, not for criminals, but for truths so paradigm-shattering they'd tear open the veil between dimensions, truths that would unravel religion, yes, but also science, history, human identity itself. It's easy to romanticize secrecy, but sometimes there is a reason the door stays closed. So the question becomes, are the Vatican guards protecting sacred memory, or are they the last line of defense between us and a truth we're not ready to face? And if we are ready, if consciousness has evolved enough to receive it, then maybe the real danger isn't what's in the vault. Maybe the real danger is how long we've been kept from it. Because at a certain point, suppression becomes violence, and silence becomes control. So when you next see the image of Swiss guards in bright robes, standing at attention in a marble hallway, ask yourself, are they protecting the Church? Or are they standing between you and the awakening they fear most? Because truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. And the moment the door cracks open, nothing will ever be the same again. Who gave them the right to decide what's holy and what's heresy? To bury ancient texts beneath marble and gold while telling the world they never existed? To hide revelations that could heal the human spirit, just to protect a narrative? Because when truth is centralized, so is power. And the question no one dares ask is this: who benefits when your soul is kept in the dark? The Vatican has long positioned itself as the gatekeeper of divine knowledge, the only voice authorized to interpret what is sacred. For centuries, it's been more than a church. It's been a filter, a fortress of theological curation. But beneath the rituals and incense, beneath the Latin hymns and stained glass light, a pattern emerges. Control. Control over what you believe. Control over what you question. Control over the path your soul is told it must walk. And yet, that path was never theirs to dictate, because truth real truth, is not something granted. It is something remembered. The mystics knew this. The ancient Essenes, the Gnostics, the desert prophets and cave dwellers, they didn't wait for permission to awaken. They went inward. They found the divine not in cathedrals, but in stillness. Not in papal decrees, but in presence. Not through intermediaries, but through intimacy with the infinite. But that kind of empowerment terrifies institutions. Because if the soul realizes it doesn't need a hierarchy, doesn't need sacraments to touch the sacred, doesn't need a robe or a ring to speak to the divine, then the empire falls. So what did the Vatican do? They centralized the sacred. They erased the feminine. They called inner knowing blasphemy. And they wrapped the infinite in doctrine. The archives, those endless shelves and locked vaults, aren't just historical. They're symbolic. They represent every part of you that was taught to ask permission to feel divine. Every time you were told enlightenment lives in someone else's book, someone else's voice, someone else's hand. But here's the truth. No one gave them the right. They took it, and they kept it. Because centralized truth creates dependency, and dependency keeps the world asleep. But the soul, your soul, was never designed for dependency. It was built for direct revelation, for communion without intermediaries, for memory without permission. So when you ask, who gave them the right to hide this? The answer is, we did, by forgetting, by submitting, by turning our own light outward. But that ends now, because the veil is thinning, the stories are unraveling, the archives can no longer contain what wants to rise, and the soul, it's stirring, not with rage, but with remembrance, because the right to truth is not given, it is claimed. And once you reclaim it, once you remember that the sacred lives in you, no institution, no dogma, no vault of forbidden scrolls can ever hold you again. They buried the light, but the light never forgot how to find its way back, and neither did you. They act like the soul is a mystery, as if no one really knows what happens after death, as if it's all just faith, belief, blind hope. But what if that's not true? What if the Vatican, beneath its solemn cathedrals and secret vaults, knows exactly what happens when we die, and has known for a very long time? Inside the archives, beyond the Gospels and Gregorian manuscripts, lie scrolls far older than Christianity, papyrus texts from Egypt, tablets from Mesopotamia, alchemical codices written in lost tongues, sacred writings that speak not of eternal damnation or golden harps, but of light realms, soul journeys, and the return. In these texts, the soul is not a passenger waiting to be judged. It's a traveler, an immortal being that moves through cycles, realms, and lifetimes, learning, refining, remembering. The ancient Egyptians wrote of the Ba and Ka, aspects of the soul that separated and reunited after death, guided through the Duat by divine intelligence. The Book of the Dead was not a myth, it was a map, and the Vatican has copies of it. Some say the earliest Christian mystics studied these texts in secret, that even Jesus, before the ministry, before the cross, was initiated into esoteric teachings that echoed the soul sciences of Egypt and India. Reincarnation wasn't heresy in the beginning, it was truth. Clement of Alexandria spoke of it. Origen, one of the Church's earliest theologians, taught that the soul returns life after life until it remembers its origin. But those teachings were stripped, erased, declared dangerous, not because they were false, but because they made the Church unnecessary. If the soul remembers that death is not the end, that it is a passage, not a punishment, then the fear collapses, and with it, so does the control. In 553 AD, at the Second Council of Constantinople, the idea of reincarnation was officially condemned. And just like that, centuries of mystic truth were branded blasphemy. But they didn't destroy the texts. They hid them. They placed them under lock and key in the deepest corners of the Vatican vaults. Because to admit that the soul is eternal, that it returns with purpose, that it passes through light realms not defined by sin, but by resonance, would upend the foundation of every sermon built on fear. It would mean you don't need saving. You need remembering. It would mean hell is not a place, but a state of forgetting. And heaven is not a reward, but a frequency of awareness. The Church knows this. The mystics within it always have. They've just never been the ones holding the microphone. So ask yourself, what else do they know about what happens when you take your final breath? And more importantly, why have they worked so hard to make sure you don't know it too? Because if the soul cannot die, then it cannot be owned. And maybe that is the most dangerous truth of all. They show you incense and robes. They show you marble floors, polished chalices, and prayers spoken in Latin. But that's not all they do, because behind closed doors, far from the grand cathedrals and the eyes of the faithful, another form of ritual unfolds. Not public, not performative, but esoteric. Whispers have emerged from former insiders, scholars, even those who've brushed too close to the inner sanctum, that some of the Vatican's most powerful ceremonies don't resemble the Christianity most people know. They resemble the ancient mystery schools, the rituals of Eleusis, of Egypt, of Babylon. Behind the gilded gates of the Holy See, the rites are different. They don't teach dogma. They invoke energy. It begins in silence. Circles, candles, codes. Not mass, but initiation. Symbols drawn from the Hermetic tradition. Prayers not recited, but intoned, as if unlocking something vibrational. Ancient languages spoken not for understanding, but for resonance. Why? Because vibration is the real key. And these rituals aren't just performances. They are technologies of consciousness. Some say these ceremonies, hidden from public view, are designed not to worship God, but to commune with forces older than the Church itself. Forces buried in early Christianity. Forces aligned with the ancient mysteries. Take, for example, the rituals around the Black Madonna, often displayed publicly in small chapels, but venerated secretly as symbols of the earth, the void, the dark womb of creation, or the coded architecture of Vatican chapels themselves, built not just as places of worship, but as energy chambers. Many hold exact geometric proportions mirroring the pyramids, the Temple of Solomon, the sacred sites of Isis, the dome above, the cross below. It is not just design, it is initiation through space. And then there are the garments, robes that carry colors of planetary influence, rings embedded with esoteric sigils, staffs that align with zodiacal markers. It's not fantasy, it's formulas drawn from astrology, alchemy, and ancient Kabbalah. Publicly, they preach simplicity, faith. But behind the veil, they practice something else entirely. Not out of malice, but out of preservation. Because the Church knows something the world forgot, that symbols activate memory, that ritual is a gateway, that through ceremony, one can change the state of consciousness, not just of the individual, but of the collective. So why hide it? Because power is most effective when the people don't know they hold it too. Imagine if you realized that ritual was your birthright, That communion didn't require hierarchy, but presence. That awakening wasn't granted, but remembered. The Vatican didn't destroy the mystery teachings. They absorbed them, wrapped them in velvet, buried them in Latin, and called it tradition. But beneath the pageantry, the old rites remain. And now, they are stirring again, because when the world is ready to remember, even the most hidden ceremonies cannot stay silent forever. There's a building in Vatican City that few tourists talk about. It's not a chapel, not a library. It's called the Paul VI Audience Hall. But its true name might as well be the Serpent's throne. Look closely, step back, tilt your head. The shape of the hall, curved, arched, symmetrical, forms the unmistakable silhouette of a reptilian head. 2 eyes, flared sides like a cobra's hood, windows shaped like slits, and at the center, a stage, a mouth. This isn't speculation, this is geometry. A serpent, carved in steel and stone, built with intention, and the Pope delivers messages from inside its jaws. Coincidence or design? The deeper you go, the harder it is to ignore. Inside the hall, the ceiling curves like the roof of a reptilian skull. The symmetrical eyes beam light down from above, gazing over the audience. Even the flooring converges toward the mouth, where the speaker stands, amplifying the sense of entering something alive. And then, there's the sculpture. Placed directly behind the Pope's throne is a monstrous bronze creation titled The Resurrection. But what rises behind Christ doesn't resemble light. It resembles chaos. Twisted bodies, serpentine coils, a figure of Christ not ascending, but erupting from a pit of destruction. Some say it's art, but others see something else, the echo of a different resurrection, one not from heaven, but from the underworld. And here's the thing, the serpent isn't new to Christianity. It appears in Genesis, in the garden, as the deceiver. But go back further, and the symbol changes. In ancient cultures, the serpent was wisdom, kundalini energy, transformation. In Egypt, the ERASED serpent represented sovereignty. In India, the coiled snake at the base of the spine was divine energy rising. In Gnostic texts, the serpent was the liberator, offering Eve not sin, but gnosis, knowledge. So which version did the Church preserve? And which one did it bury? The architecture of the audience hall isn't just provocative, it's revealing. It points to a hidden truth, that the Vatican didn't erase the serpent, it embraced it, but behind closed doors. To the public, they preach good versus evil, God versus devil. But in secret, they've always known the power of symbols. Because symbols speak to the unconscious. They plant themselves in the soul. So why build a serpent? Why sit at its tongue? Some say it's an act of power, of mastery over ancient forces. Others say it's a silent confession, a whisper that the roots of the Church may stretch deeper than Jerusalem, all the way back to serpent gods, to ancient knowledge, to truths too wild, too old, too untamable for the pews. But the architecture doesn't lie. Stone remembers what words forget. And if the Vatican built a serpent, it's not the snake that should scare you. It's what it guards, and what they're still trying to keep from your eyes. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and that is where the real awakening begins. Some secrets are buried, but others are hidden in plain sight, not because they want you to find them easily, but because they know most people never look. In Vatican City, truth isn't just locked behind vault doors, it's carved into ceilings, painted across frescoes, whispered through stained glass, a symphony of symbols, hidden in full view. And the ones who placed them there? They understood something deeper than doctrine. They knew that the human soul remembers through imagery, because while language divides, symbols unite. A cross, a key, a serpent, a chalice, a spiral. Each one carries a vibration older than words. And so, the Church didn't destroy all the old teachings. It repurposed them, wrapped them in gold, hung them in cathedrals, and encoded the ancient truths where only the initiated would see. Why? Because secrets, when suppressed completely, tend to erupt. But when you bury them just beneath the surface, when you camouflage them as art, ritual, or architecture, they can survive for centuries without suspicion. Consider the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, a master artist, and many believe, an initiate of mystery traditions. His brush held more than beauty. It held riddles, sacred geometry, hidden hands, figures erased from doctrine, yet honored in oil. Or look to the floor plans of cathedrals, spirals, compass points, and star alignments. Why would a religion supposedly built on simplicity and salvation encode its temples like ancient energy maps? Because not all secrets were meant to be destroyed. Some were meant to test you. The mystics called it the breadcrumb trail, a path woven through time, left by those who remembered, those who knew the age of forgetting would come, but so would the age of remembering. And that time is now. The pinecone statue in Vatican Square, the obelisks, the triple crowns, the papal rituals that mirror the rites of Babylon, Egypt, and Rome. They left you clues, not to deceive you, but to reveal, only when you're ready, because awakening can't be forced. It must be chosen, and symbols have a way of bypassing logic and lighting up something ancient inside you. That flicker you feel when you notice the serpent in the architecture. That chill down your spine when you realize the chalice is a womb. That sudden knowing when two pieces click and you whisper, "Wait, was that always there?" That is the soul decoding what the eyes forgot to see. They've hidden truths in plain sight, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Because power hoards, but wisdom survives. And if you're starting to see the symbols now, you're not just waking up, you're remembering the language of the soul. Because some things were never truly hidden. They were just waiting for you to finally look. The Vatican Secret Archives are not just paper. They are power, and not the kind that rules by sword or army, but by story. Because whoever controls the story controls the soul. This vault beneath Vatican City isn't just a warehouse of aging manuscripts. It's a fortress of narrative, a repository not of facts, but of frameworks. And what's buried within those 53 miles of shelving is not only historical, it is spiritual leverage. Information shapes perception, and perception becomes belief. And belief, that is the currency of civilizations. Entire empires have risen and fallen because of what people were told to be true. And in that telling, in that molding of myth and memory, the Church learned something no empire ever truly mastered. You don't need to rule the land if you rule the mind. Think about it. With a few edits to scripture, a few gospels removed, a few heretics exiled or burned, the message of inner divinity became obedience to outer authority. The mystic path of direct knowing became ritualized dogma. The feminine became erased. The body became sinful. The earth became lesser. And the sacred, once everywhere, became centralized, institutionalized, and eventually monetized. And what guarded that transformation? The archives, not with guns, with silence. Because it's not what's said from the pulpit that controls history. It's what's withheld. When you decide which texts are canon, which teachings are preserved, which voices are remembered and which are erased, you don't just shape faith, you manufacture spiritual reality. And that's the power the Vatican holds in its vault. It's not just the documents, it's the authority to define what is holy and what is heresy. That authority is the most potent form of control the world has ever known. And still, the deeper question remains, what else do they have? What gospels never made it out? What maps, prophecies, technologies, what blueprints of human consciousness have been locked away, not because they were false, but because they were too true? The kind of truth that awakens the sovereign spirit, the kind that dissolves hierarchy, the kind that turns believers into knowers. Because a soul that remembers its power cannot be ruled. And perhaps that's the greatest threat the archives contain. Not just lost texts, but the seed of liberation itself. And if that seed ever escapes, if enough people begin to remember what was buried, not just in the vault, but in themselves, then the spell breaks, then the veil falls, and the empire built on forgetting will finally face the light of what it tried to hide. Because in the end, the most dangerous truth is not what's hidden in the archives. It's what happens when you find it. And remember, it was always yours to begin with. What if you stopped asking for permission to remember? What if the truth was never behind a locked vault, but beneath your skin? Humming in the silence, waiting in the stillness, speaking in the language before language. They built walls, they wrote rules, they sealed the records, silenced the mystics, burned the bridges to your sacred memory. But still, something lived, not in the archives, in you. Because the greatest secret is that the remembering was never theirs to give. It was always yours to awaken. You see, they taught you to bow, to fear, to outsource your knowing, to kneel before books you couldn't read, in languages you didn't speak, interpreted by men you couldn't question. And for centuries, it worked. People forgot, not because they were weak, but because they trusted. But now, the veil is thinning, the silence is breaking, and something ancient is stirring in the hearts of those who were never supposed to question. The dreamers, the seekers, the misfits who couldn't sit still in the pews, who closed their eyes and saw temples, who touched trees and felt prayers, who heard a different voice, not booming from pulpits, but whispering from within. And now, the question arrives, not from Rome, from your soul. What if everything you've been told to seek outside was a reflection of what's already inside? What if the vault is a metaphor? What if the 53 miles of hidden manuscripts mirror the forgotten miles inside your own memory? Generations of silenced wisdom, waiting to be read again. Because the truth isn't lost. It's encrypted, encoded in dreams, buried in symbols, echoed in myths, hidden in plain sight across stone, fire, water, and song. The real revolution begins not with rebellion, but with remembrance, with standing before the inner altar and saying, I will no longer wait to be told what is sacred. I will no longer ask for access to my own soul. I remember now. That's the question that changes everything. Not, what are they hiding? But, what am I ready to see? And when enough of us ask it, the walls tremble, the archives shiver, not because we stormed the gates, but because we outgrew them. The era of secrets is ending. The age of awakening is here. So let them guard their vault. You have your own. and inside it is the light they never wanted you to find, but you did. And now you know. Not because someone gave you permission, but because you finally stopped waiting and started remembering what was never truly lost. If something awakened in you while watching this, it wasn't by accident. It was the soul remembering. The truth has never been hidden, only buried. And now, piece by piece, you are uncovering it. So don't let this be the end. Let it be a beginning. Leave a comment below, not just to speak, but to witness. What did this awaken in you? What are you beginning to remember? Your voice might be the key someone else is searching for. And if this journey moved you, share it with someone still stuck in the illusion, with someone still afraid to question, with someone who knows there's more. Because this isn't just a video. It's a map back to what we were never meant to forget. And if you're ready to keep walking this path with us, subscribe now, not just to a channel, but to a deeper unfolding. We release each video like an offering, a mirror, a match, a sacred thread in the great tapestry of remembrance. Because the age of silence is over, and the veil, it's already falling. Welcome to the hidden voyage. Welcome home, soul whisperer and soul creator, the hidden voyage. If this journey moves something in you, don't let it end in silence. Let it echo. Share it with someone still afraid to speak of death, still avoiding the mirror, still pretending time is infinite. Let this video be the hand you extend, the torch you pass, the doorway they didn't know they were seeking. Leave a comment, not just to speak, but to witness. What part of you is beginning to awaken? What have you been avoiding that now asks to be seen? And if your soul feels ready to keep walking, deeper, quieter, truer, then this is your place. Not just a channel, but a temple. Subscribe and join a circle of seekers who no longer run from the end because they've begun to live from it. We release these videos like offerings, each one a prayer, each one a mirror, each one a map to awaken before the end, to remember who you are beneath the name, to walk together toward what cannot die, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred step on the hidden voyage. Soul whisperer and soul creator. The hidden voyage.